I'm Megan Skidmore. For 2.5 years, I have been talking about evolving faith journeys. I started to tire of the heaviness of this focus. I had the clear message come through. It is time for Beyond the Shadow of Doubt podcast to evolve into Living Beyond the Shadow of Doubt podcast. With the same vulnerability and unapologetic authenticity, I will be focusing on the joy in this journey, the life and the living that comes on the other side of maybe, on the other side of what's possible. I want to talk about claiming spiritual sovereignty and becoming your own captain of your vessel. Let's celebrate releasing what no longer aligns for you and connecting with your higher power and honor expanding your energy field to make room for all things new. Hello.
Hello.
Hey, Brittany. All right.
Yes.
So welcome to today's episode of Living Beyond the Shadow of Doubt. For those of you who are newer to the podcast, welcome. To those that have been around a little bit longer, you know that I am reimagining my podcast. I have been focusing on faith journeys for the past 2.5 years, and I still will be focusing on that, and also adding a really important, I feel, ingredient, and that is a much larger focus on the living that comes when we choose to step into our courageous and brave self and venture into that uncertainty and that unknown. And we are just amazed and perhaps pleasantly surprised and rewarded with just so many beautiful experiences and gifts and just joy. And so I want to highlight and share those. Today, I have Pastor Brittany Mangelson, and this is a conversation I've been wanting to have for a while, and the timing is just perfect. So thank you so much for making time to have this discussion here with me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited for it.
So welcome. I know a little bit about your background, but I'm going to have you share with our listeners kind of your origin story, where you came from, how you got there, family and faith, background, and perhaps education, all of those things.
Yeah, so quick intro is I'm 36 years old. I was born and raised in Provo, born and raised LDS, married in the temple, did not go on a mission. I was married before I was 21. I have 3 kids. We still live in Utah County, just in the heart of Utah County, sandwiched between Provo and Salt Lake. And yeah, my husband and I went through a faith. I like to use the word crisis because it very much felt like a crisis in the moment. So our faith crisis started about in 2012, and then I'm more comfortable now with like faith transition language or faith expansion language that kind of grew out of that crisis. So we joined Community of Christ in 2015, and I have been a pastor since 2023. I had to think about that, of the Salt Lake congregation. So yeah, that's kind of the very brief overview. I have 2 14-year-olds, they're twins, and then a 10-year-old little boy. So that's kind of me in a nutshell.
That's amazing. I'm curious to know, what about your parents, your grandparents, your husband's parents, grandparents? Are they also born and raised in the LDS faith origin?
Yeah, for the most part. So my parents' family and both of my in-laws, my husband's mother and father, all of their family goes back to the pioneer days, various places in Europe, came over, joined the church back east, and then walked across the plains. My dad is a convert, so he converted as a teenager in Southern California. His parents ended up converting several decades after my dad did. But yeah, we definitely have those pioneer stories. It's funny. A lot of people in our congregation have the family history app, and they'll pull the app out. People have actually done this with my mother, have pulled the app out to figure out how we're related. And we're all, 5th or 6th cousins. So yeah, we definitely have that pioneer stock. They're all still active and engaged, temple going, calling, holding, members of the LDS Church. So it's been a little bit tricky to navigate at times, but we're far enough into this that things are okay.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that, because if you're okay with that, I'd like to talk a little bit more in depth about that, navigating that relationship, those relationships, because I know that all the experiences are wide and varied that folks will have when you are following your intuition, you're following your heart. And that means, stepping away from sometimes a very long held faith tradition. And people will term it in different ways. Maybe it's not stepping away from necessarily in the way that they might think in your heart. You're bringing some of that with you and building upon that. But if you don't mind, if we can rewind a little bit to 2012, just for a minute, can you share with us? You said that was kind of the beginnings of it felt you used the terminology faith crisis. Can you just briefly share what were some of the things that came up that were the big kind of motivators for that pivot in your journey?
Yeah, oh gosh, there was a lot, but I had struggles with current leadership and current policy, right? And again, this is 2012.
Yeah.
I always, even as a little girl, sitting in my Mormon pew. Also, I tend to use the word Mormon just because I grew up in like Gordon B. Hinckley's Mormonism, and that was, we knew it, we lived it, we loved it, we were proud of it. So
Right.
my apologies if that flips out every once in a while. But as a little girl, I was very aware of gender inequality in the church, and I would ask questions and I would ask, why aren't we learning about the women in the scriptures? Or why can't boys pass the sacrament? And, I was like a little kid. I wasn't necessarily thinking that I was going to be the crusader for gender equality. But it was something that always bothered me. There's very clear inequity in the temple and in the endowment. And I had very clear, a very clear moment where I was like, oh, I can see why, the abuse of priesthood and unrighteous dominion happen because there's just opportunity
Mhm.
for it, right? And I just remember thinking, like, I'm really glad that I got one of the good ones. My husband is the least domineering, like, macho male man ever. So I very much was glad that I got someone who wasn't, an alpha male type. But it was really disturbing because I had friends and acquaintances that were in harmful relationships and who had had priesthood kind of the priesthood authority of their leaders or of their husbands kind of thrown down at them to shut them up and things like that. And I was watching all of this happen while also having my own feminist awakening, my own political awakening, recognizing just the deep inequality in the world. So for me, it started with, I guess it could be summed up with like social issues. My husband, his start of all of this was more doctrinal and historical. And so we were kind of having these parallel journeys side by side. And I was more resistant to leaning into those doubts, leaning into those frustrations, because I thought, well, even if it's complicated, right? We can be in the church and be part of the change and all of that. And it got to a point in 2014. So we had been struggling for several years. In 2014 is when the ordained women movement founder, Kate Kelly, was excommunicated. And I had met Kate. She was someone who we weren't best friends by any means, but I was friends with her friends. We kind of hung around the same circles, things like that. And I was so brokenhearted that someone who I agreed with, who I wanted to see church leadership acknowledge and engage in questions and, respectful dialogue, seeing her get excommunicated, seeing other members of the ordained women board get disfellowshipped or have their recommends taken away, etc., was really disturbing for me. Because I thought, if I were as brave as they were, I would be in that position too. And it's only because they're speaking out that they're getting in trouble. So when you realize that about yourself, it doesn't make you feel welcome. It's like if they only knew who I was or what I believed or what I was struggling with, I would be on the chopping block as well. So my husband had been, like I said, looking at church history, and he was very intrigued by the RLDS Church, now Community of Christ, and the fact that, it's a church that ordains women, it's a church that embraces biblical scholarship and different theologies. There's not doctrine, there's theology, which are very different approaches to engaging in religious discourse. we're affirming of the LGBTQ community. And so for him, it was very much like, how in the world did a church that started out the same as the LDS church end up in this place? So he started listening to podcasts and reaching out to some former LDS folks who had made the journey over to Community of Christ. And we really didn't have a solid plan. When we started attending, I ended up going to a camp. Community of Christ is really big into camping, and I just seen leadership, men and women serving the sacrament or serving communion side by side, recognizing that queer affirmation is something that is completely embraced, especially in our little pocket in Utah. I could not imagine going back where, again, if they knew who I really was, if they knew what I really believed or what I was struggling with, I would be at risk of being kicked out. So it was right after Kate Kelly's excommunication when I started going to Community of Christ. And we almost immediately told our church leadership, we're going to test this out, maybe take us off, release us from our callings, take us off the lists and things like that. And it was really scary and it was hard. I'm a Provo girl. I'm a Utah Mormon in most of the ways. I literally have a Stanley Cup next to me. Like, I fit so many of the stereotypes. And so to go against that, yeah, it's really scary. So that's why I like to use the word crisis, especially at the beginning, because my entire identity was gone. I was also, 3 or 4 months postpartum with my son. So I was hormonal and vulnerable and really felt like I needed community. And I was just looking for a safe place to ask questions and to not be kicked out, essentially. And we stuck around. So yeah, that's kind of what started it. I will say, I think nowadays there's a lot more room for nuance in the LDS church. Back in 2012, there really wasn't. You couldn't really raise questions in Sunday school. And, most people, you look at the political pollings in Utah, and most people at that point were against gay marriage. So if you spoke out in Sunday school, you were outing yourself politically. Like, it was a really messy time. And there just really wasn't a lot of places or podcasts that were trying to hold that nuanced space. So I'm not saying I wouldn't have left if that wouldn't have happened now, but then it felt like I had to run. It was all or nothing. And I just, like, we bounced pretty fast.
I hear what you're saying. There was a more black and white perspective, and it has evolved quite a bit in the past, I guess now 12, 13 years. There's some things that you brought up when you shared, and thank you for being open with me about that and with our listeners. You mentioned a few things. I'd love for you to expand on a teeny bit more. You experienced from a young age, you had this realization, this awareness of the gender inequality in church. And you mentioned you saw friends. You said you were one of the quote lucky ones with your husband, but you did have friends who experienced unrighteous dominion. I'd love for you if you could share a little bit more about that, so those that are listening that aren't of the LDS background can understand that. And also, this is really fascinating to me. I've not ever heard it expressed the way you expressed when you were investigating the Church of Christ, and even now you noticed they have a difference between doctrine versus theology, engaging in a religious discourse. I'd love if you could speak to that just a little bit more. And then the third thing I just want to add is, I think it's just so important that you bring up that you did not feel safe to ask questions, that you would fear that you would get kicked out if you even brought up questions, because I experienced that as well. That is what prompted this podcast, because I found when I had questions coming up early on in this journey, I've had many opportunities to reflect on what was happening. I didn't know it at the time, but I was experiencing so much shame that I just didn't want to let them come up. I didn't want to acknowledge them, but yet they were there. And so the cognitive dissonance, the pressure just grew and grew, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. And so kudos to you. That was a very different time, and to have questions and be able to act on that. I hear you when you said it was pretty scary and hard to act on these, share with our leaders that we were investigating, and then act on it by asking to be released and whatnot. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. And if you don't mind just adding a little bit more.
Yeah. So yeah, I definitely I mean, I want to be careful, right? Because so much of this is LDS culture and American culture, right? When I talk about like men domineering over women, the culture that I absolutely grew up in was, only get an education as a backup plan. Getting married was priority over a mission. You weren't supposed to delay having children. And it's not like I really even heard these things from my house. Like they weren't pounded in me at home. It was just a lot of religious upbringing, right? Like this is just the lessons. This is the personal progress manual. This is just the messaging that I absorbed. And so, yeah, I went to Utah State up in Logan, Utah, and, girls were 19, 20 and stressed out about not being married. And the men in our singles ward would like put pressure and, we weren't supposed to say no to a date and like all these social conditionings where women were definitely supposed to be subordinate to men. And yeah, I had friends who gave up their education, who dropped out in order to fulfill that commandment to multiply and replenish the earth, and who, would move different places because of their spouse's career or their spouse's schooling. And it wasn't a mutually made decision. It was like, this is happening and you're my spouse. And so this is what we're going to do. And, there was a couple experiences where friends had reached out and they were really struggling with these decisions that their spouse had made on behalf of the family, right? Because men are supposed to be the head of the household. And if they have
Which
a
means
prompting
that,
or a revelation,
yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
for the
You're
family. Yeah. So, like, if they have a prompting or a revelation for the family, like the wife is supposed to just follow suit. And, and so there were a couple of incidences where that had happened. And like I said, when I went through the temple, it was very clear men are the head of the households and women are to follow. And so that's just recognizing that, like, oh, this isn't necessarily a cultural thing. I mean, a lot of it's culture, and that culture I also think is shifting, but it is doctrinal to some degree. And so that was really alarming. And I found feminist Mormon housewives, and there was a lot of abuse stories that were coming out on that forum. And again, like these were my friends, and yet these husbands of theirs held callings and no one knew what was happening behind the scenes. And then have these anonymous blog posts and these forums where women are like, no, this is not consensual. Like I don't have a voice in this decision or in my marriage or in my home or whatever. So yeah, I really recognize that, like, oof, I really did luck out marrying a guy that was just like, I mean, he's always seen me, as his equal. And yeah, he is the last person that would, assert authority like that over me. But it was really disturbing when I kind of put all the pieces together where I'm like, oh, maybe this isn't just like a few bad apples. Maybe the system is set up to train boys to be leaders and train boys to be the head of the household. And women, the messaging that young girls get is to marry a priesthood holder and to follow their husband as the head of the household. So, and I also just want to recognize, I get that that's not everyone's experience, but that
Yeah.
was absolutely the message that I picked up as a little girl and carried it through my young adulthood. And yeah, I think of some of the guys that I dated in college and I'm like, oof, they would have, they were more of that, alpha male type. And yeah, I feel like I dodged some bullets there. So,
Yeah, thank
uh,
you for sharing that. I didn't mean to interrupt you a little bit earlier.
no, you're good.
And then the doctrine versus theology, that concept. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think it's probably important to say that Community of Christ as a denomination has been through a Mormon faith crisis, faith transition, faith expansion, and they are several decades into that. So when the work of D. Michael Quinn was coming out, and just things that make church history more complicated, Community of Christ really leaned into that and shifted from a more we are the one true church model that would have absolutely been combative, to the LDS story and narrative, to embracing more theology. So the way that I see it is doctrine is certainty. Doctrine is maybe a list of beliefs. Doctrine is, we know this about eternal families. We know this about the nature of God. We know this about whatever. And theology is more engaging in the question and in the conversation of like, well, this is one way to look at the concept of heaven or salvation or the nature of God. This is one way to look at, the problem of evil and suffering, whatever concept you're trying to engage with. And I mean, I'm not a scholar or a theologian, but so that's just kind of my like armchair way that I describe it. So, Community of Christ absolutely has beliefs, but we don't have stagnant doctrine that can quote unquote never change.
There is a lot going on in the world. If you find yourself doom scrolling or watching a lot of news, this is actually inhibiting your peace. It makes it easier to get discouraged or lose hope. If you're like me, you like to stay abreast. But I am curious to know, what practices do you have in place that help you recenter, get grounded, connect to your inner wisdom, and remember you are powerful? On the first Friday of each month, I host a coaching session that anyone is welcome to join to get a glimpse into what I do. As a trauma-informed life transformations coach, I employ emotional alchemy and story coaching in my work. My primary goal is to help others help themselves. One of the ways is by raising awareness of, one, how and where we store our energy, two, where we receive more of it, and three, the sources that drain our energy. So in this monthly call, I will guide participants in what I term raise your vibration sessions. I'm teaching you to increase your awareness of your energy in your body and the messages available to you. I would be so honored to have you on the call. Register at the link in the show notes.
We are willing to engage in theological questions. One, just really quick, right now we are discussing the concept of infant baptism. And will we allow folks to join Community of Christ if they were baptized before the age of 8? So that is doctrine in the LDS church, right? Like you have to be 8 years old to be baptized, and you would need to be rebaptized in order to join the LDS church. But in Community of Christ, we're looking at the theology of baptism and recognizing like, okay, what is the purpose of baptism? What does that mean? What does, just all these questions that come up with it. Is infant baptism valid? Like let's discuss it. Let's look at the history of baptism. Let's look at the culture. Let's look at what other denominations do, those kinds of things. So for me, theology is more of kind of a back and forth dialogue with these gospel topics. Again, that's probably a sloppy answer, but that's kind of how I view it. And it makes me excited.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's a great answer. And it strikes me as you're sharing that in order to be able to engage in a dialogue of that sort, you do need to have a foundation where all members' voices are seen, heard, valued equally, regardless of gender, or queer identity even. And that's fascinating. Thank you for sharing that and explaining your views on that. So you've touched on some of the challenges or struggles that you have experienced along the way with your faith community and sharing with your leaders. We haven't touched on family yet, if that's something you feel comfortable with, or just maybe anything else that might come up for you that, and maybe you still are, to be honest, because I don't see this as linear, right? This journey, it comes and goes. It's like the waves. It can be up, it can be down. It's always ongoing. We're always expanding. That's the definition of expansion. And, so if you have any thoughts that you can share there. And additionally, like, how has your faith/spiritual journey been different than maybe you thought it would have been?
Yeah, those are good questions. So I think, I recognize that a lot of people, when they quote unquote leave the LDS church, they leave religion altogether. And if they don't leave religion altogether, they tend to go to the Unitarians or something that has, little to nothing to do with Joseph Smith and the Restoration. So the fact that I left the LDS church and then went to Community of Christ is kind of weird for people. Because I get a lot of, but what about Joseph's polygamy, or what about? And I have had to face every single what about in order to be comfortable with my faith. So it's kind of interesting because with family and with friends who are LDS or who are ex-Mormon, I kind of feel like I'm in this like halfway place where I understand where they're coming from. I understand the LDS perspective. I understand the angry, I don't want anything to do with it, ex-Mormon perspective. But I've actively chosen to walk this line that's like, well, we're gonna live, a nuanced faith within a faith community. And like I said, Community of Christ has been through their own faith expansion. And so, I think a lot of people think that Community of Christ is like a liberal LDS church, and that's not true at all. There are a lot of differences. And so I'm able to lean into those differences more when I'm talking to, an ex-Mormon friend who just wants to burn it all to the ground. But then there are some similarities. And so, yeah, I can lean into those similarities when I'm talking to an active LDS person. So I'm code switching literally all the time. So that's fun. But what I have found, what I have found is that, with family and friends who are still active LDS, I mean, it's really hard to go through a faith crisis, transition, whatever you want to call it. And the last thing I want to do is to like yank people down that road. I mean, I know people who have lost marriages. I know people who have lost their livelihood. I mean, people have taken their own lives because of a faith crisis. Like this is very real. And so for me, it's very irresponsible to try to push somebody into that. And I also recognize the LDS church works great for a lot of people, right? I don't want everyone to leave. So it's again, I find myself in this place where I'm constantly trying to stand for the values that I do hold, which some of them are very against LDS doctrine. Just the fact that I'm a woman and I'm a pastor is very threatening to a lot of people. So trying to balance that while also having love and compassion for where people are at and respecting that, right? Like if they want to have their boundaries, great. I want to have my boundaries, right? So when we told our parents that we were doing this, we ended up writing an email. And, we didn't want them to think that we weren't being thoughtful about this. And the reality is we went to the temple and prayed about this. Like we did the things in order to feel confident in our decision. And so we shared those things with our parents, not to break down not to break down their faith, but we had real problems with Joseph Smith, and we had real problems with the Book of Mormon, and we had real problems with the current leadership. And yet we weren't willing to give everything up because, again, we are in a denomination that ties back to Joseph Smith. And so I've always been open. I mean, I really have always been an open book about, digging into these tricky topics. I just recently talked to a seeker in a different state yesterday about, some of these tricky theological topics, right? And so I'm willing to engage in that and to help people do faith on their own terms. Honestly, that's what my entire life mission is at this point. But it is really hard to balance because I want to respect my family and I want to respect my friends. And I get that just my existence, my position with the church can be threatening. So I don't know if that kind of answered your question, but I will say, it's been relatively successful. I'm one of 5 kids. All of my siblings are supportive of me and the choices that I've made. My oldest brother was recently dropping off his kiddo at BYU, and they ordained their youngest son at my house during a family dinner. And he was like, can we do that? Is that going to be weird? And it was totally fine. And so we've been able to create kind of this ecumenical restoration circle that just kind of does our best to get along. But does that mean that every once in a while, a snarky comment doesn't come out of my mouth because I'm angry at something that Nilsson said or did? I absolutely do that, and I try to curb that a little bit. And it is hard because my congregation is filled with people who have been ostracized from their wards, people that didn't want to leave and were forced to leave. So I see that side of the LDS church a lot, and it's really hard for me to not get super
Yeah.
upset and like defensive about it, but I do try to have grace. So,
Yeah, you're human like the rest of us. You have all
yeah.
the emotions and you're allowed to have them. I'm really inspired by this way you and your extended family, you're moving forward together with this mutual respect for one another's belief. At the end of the day, I think that's what's really most important. That reflects our character, right? Our honor, our who we are at the core of our being. And so this is a really good segue into, I want to hear all about the blissful, the amazing, the epiphanies, the joy that you have experienced. And if this resonates, I'm imagining because of your unique perspective that you said you could see from a very young age about the importance of women having a voice and then with time, I'm sure queer folks having a voice too. Like, have you been able to see them step into their joy, perhaps help them find that voice that they didn't have before, or just realize in the first place that they actually do have one and can use and acknowledge it? I'd love to hear about that part.
Yeah, and this is such a big part, right? And I remember when we were leaving, multiple people told me that, we could leave the church and we would maybe have temporary happiness, but we would never find joy. And I mean, that exact quote was told to me. So I don't know if a church leader at some point had said that. And so it just kind of became part of, the rhetoric that LDS folks use, but it really scared me because I thought they were right. And thankfully, I've learned that they are absolutely not right. And you can have joy outside of the LDS Church and or organized religion in general. I mean, I want to be clear about that. I think joy comes with living authentically. I think joy comes from community. I think joy comes from equality and recognizing the humanity in one another. It doesn't always have to be because you are in the right belief system and in the right community and everyone else can't experience that. So when the November policy came out in the LDS Church, that excluded kids
Yeah, if you could
from
just
queer
briefly
parents.
share. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, it's called like the policy of exclusion. I don't know exactly what it was or like what the official title was, but it essentially said that if you are a kid and your parents are LGBTQ in a queer relationship, you cannot be baptized, you can't have a baby blessing, you can't be ordained if you're a little boy. It was the same policy that they put on polygamist families. So you have to disavow your parents, which kids of polygamists are also required to do. And that really was terrible. And I also want to go on record and say it's terrible that it still is in effect with polygamist families, but that's a whole nother topic. But
I didn't realize that. Mhm.
it's awful. And it, for me, goes completely against, what the gospel of Jesus Christ should be. And so when that happened, we had a big influx of queer families, of queer kids who reached out to Community of Christ. So, Community of Christ in the United States has been queer affirming since 2013. We are in places in the world where it is not even legal to be gay. So we've had to kind of work around this national policy, a system of national policies, so we can be inclusive where we can. We in the United States were ready to go, right? We we were prepared to be able to welcome in queer families. Not perfectly. I also want to be clear about that. We do have an advocacy group within Community of Christ called Harmony, and they help congregations become more affirming and more welcoming. But when the Sunday after the policy came out, we completely pivoted in Salt Lake and changed the service that we were going to do. We held a service of mourning, we held a service of compassion, and we had a big potluck. And there were tons of first time visitors. And I'm still in communication with a fair amount of those folks. And, a handful of them ended up joining Community of Christ. And so seeing the pain of what it looks like to be excluded for who you are and who you love, to then watching these same folks literally live their best life and step into community, whether that is in Community of Christ or in other places, has been amazing. Like, it's been absolutely amazing. We've had trans individuals who have been baptized in Community of Christ for the main purpose of being baptized with their chosen name and with their chosen gender. So it's a complete renewal, rebirth for them in a way that, like, my baptism was very meaningful, but it wasn't, a complete name change and identity shift for me, right? I've served on many, we call them pastorate teams, essentially the bishopric of the congregation. And almost every time we have a queer person on the team. And it's been really exciting and just beautiful to see the gospel again. And I like say that because the gospel is different depending on which community you're in. But the gospel of Jesus, the message of inclusion, the message of welcome, the message of the marginalized being put in positions of power, that has been really, really cool to see. And it turns out that people who are extremely close to me in my family and in my friendship circles, have come out since my faith transition. And so being in a place where I know that I can welcome them and they will be loved for who they are, I mean, that's joyful. Like, you don't get any more joyful than that. When we talk about women, the women, especially in the Salt Lake congregation, are like running the show. Um, so many of us just wanted to be more involved. Like, we weren't apostates, right? Like, we wanted to do church. We wanted to be part of the creation of community. We wanted to work more, not less, in the LDS church. And so we have people who just dive right in and plan worship services and preach and teach Sunday school. And, we're not correlated like the LDS church, so we can really make our congregation be what it needs to be. So they choose the curriculum, right? They're choosing the hymns that we sing, they're choosing the direction that we go, and that has been super empowering. And I remember, I mean, that was how I was when I first joined. I immediately started getting involved. And actually, I have said I was doing more as a non-member in Community of Christ than I ever could have done as an LDS woman, because I was planning worship services before I was even a member. So there's a lot of opportunity, and that comes with a lot of joy, and it comes with freedom and liberation, and yeah, all of the stereotypes of, you're never going to find joy and you won't be blessed, right? Like, it I just have not found that to be reality. And I've now at this point worked with dozens and dozens of folks who have left, and the prevailing narrative is that yes, you can find joy outside of an old belief system. And I will say that I again have a lot of friends and family who are having a very nuanced approach to the LDS church, and they're finding joy in that too. And I just think when you take your spiritual life and you make it autonomous, right? Like, you take control of it. Like, that's where you're going to find joy, not following a belief system, not following leadership, not following whatever policy is in front of you. Like, all of that, just whatever. It's just noise, right? Just love people the way that Jesus taught us to love. And for me, that's what it all comes down to.
That's so beautiful. I'm so touched by your sharing how trans individuals are able to be baptized using their new chosen names. That's really meaningful. That's beautiful practice. And I can't help, but I'm just itching to ask you this question. I'd love your perspective. Do you consider yourself or call yourself a Mormon?
Well,
I'm just curious to know your response. I'm just like,
yeah, no,
yourself.
that is interesting. So I typically don't. I am good with saying former Mormon, usually is how I referred myself, because when I think about it, Community of Christ does not like the word Mormon, right? They spent a lot of time trying to convince the world that they weren't Mormon. So in Community of Christ circles, I absolutely would not use that phraseology. Around my family, I would not either, because they'd be like, "What are you talking about? You left," right? Like, But I also really do think that Mormonism is an ethnicity at this point. It is such a cultural, you can be raised LDS and then leave at 15 and, you're still Mormon. Like, I really don't like the policing, first of all, of that word and name. But if you want to claim it, claim it. And there's so many layers to what it means to be Mormon that I think that it is completely up to the individual if they want to use it or if they want to have that as part of their identity. I've not traveled a ton, but when people find out like, oh, you're from Utah, right? And oh, are you Mormon? My answer is usually I was, because I don't want them to think that I'm an active LDS member, because I'm not. That would not be true. But it's still part of them, right? It raised me for 26 years in my most formidable, vulnerable time, and I've rejected large portions of that, but it still is very meaningful to me. I can sing a primary song at the drop of a hat, right? I've got all of them memorized. Like, I can say the old Young Women's theme. I recently found out they updated it, and I was like, oh, I didn't know that. So, but yeah, I mean, it's part of my identity, and it will always be. And I think leaning into the quirks is kind of how I balance that and find, like, I don't know, live with integrity. Because yeah, you can't just wash that stuff off of your skin. Like, it's there. So how's that for a complicated answer?
That's a great answer. Did you say quirks?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So I love that. That's great. And thanks for entertaining me, humoring me on that question. So the last question I'd like to ask my guests to kind of wrap up is, tell us what it means to you, what living beyond the shadow of doubt means to you.
Yeah. So I've actually been thinking about this question for several days, because I had a young women's leader who would, bear her testimony often. And she would always say that she knew these things to be true, without a shadow of a doubt. And I had never, until I came across your podcast, I just kind of thought that that was like a her thing. Like, I really think I've only heard her say that phrase. And so I'm like, oh yeah, what exactly does that mean? And what does it mean to live beyond that? And I really have appreciated kind of that time to reflect and, sink into that a little bit. And where I've come, the conclusion that I've come to is, if you're living with a shadow, like without a shadow of a doubt, right? Something is certain, like it to be true. And I have recognized for myself how harmful that rhetoric can be, because I knew that Mormonism was true. I knew that the family proclamation as it stands was from God, right? Like, I knew, and I defended it. And because I did that, I caused a lot of harm. And I didn't really get into that, but I was a defender of, those traditional values online, and it's not great. And I did that because I quote unquote knew that it was true. And so when I think about the phrase living beyond a shadow of a doubt, like, it's like, oh, I've been knocked off that pedestal of like arrogance and certainty, and I fell pretty hard. And I had to do a lot of self-reflection and recognizing that me, as a straight white woman in America whose ancestors, took over this land in the Salt Lake Valley and we're perpetuating harm. Like, there's no way around that. Like, I can't be certain about anything anymore. And the only thing that I can be certain about is that we don't have the answers, and that the only way through this life is together. And so anything else, any other belief system, any other, again, policy, any other like thing that we as humans use to separate and divide and to build hierarchies and whatever, like, I am just very much not interested in that anymore. And, I really was interested in that at one point. And so for me, living beyond the shadow of a doubt, it's embracing doubts, it's embracing certainty, it's always being willing to pivot. If I'm faced with new information, especially that points out maybe errors in my thinking or a bias that I might have, I try really hard to lean into that and to, again, course correct. I've learned a whole lot about the queer community. I've learned a whole lot about, the BIPOC experience in America and in religion. And these are communities that I am not a part of, but I am better because I have gotten rid of my arrogance thinking that I knew everything. So it can be kind of tricky sometimes as a pastor and as a minister of a church because people will come and they'll ask, what does Community of Christ believe about X, Y, and Z? And the reality is that we don't claim to have the answers. And so when people are searching for answers, sometimes they're really disappointed by us and by me. And I have to kind of live with that because I find joy in the struggle. I find joy in the doubt. I find joy in being willing to say, hey, I was probably wrong about that, or this system or this belief or whatever that I hold really, really tight is actually causing harm. And that's a really scary thing to do and a scary way to live. And I absolutely could not do it alone, which is, I think, one huge reason why I stick with community and a faith community at that. But yeah, I'm just wrong a lot. Is what it comes down to. And recognizing that that's not actually, a bad thing to be able to admit that, you're wrong and that you can change and that you can expand. And yeah, that's kind of what's been going on in my head the last couple of days as I've been thinking about that last question. But
Well,
yeah.
I appreciate that so much, and I truly appreciate your willingness to lean into that and that internal dialogue and thinking through that. I relate to much of what you share, Brittany. I appreciate uncertainty so much now. Something that used to, quite frankly, scare me. Like I actually prefer it, I think, because I find that I'm much more teachable and moldable and able to expand from that place. So I totally get what you're saying. Totally. It's beautiful. So I didn't tell you about these, but I like to also throw out some few for funsies questions to my guests so we can get to know you a little bit more,
Okay.
just a little more lighthearted stuff. First of all, tell us your favorite book.
Oh no, that that's so hard. So I didn't really talk about my education, but I did get a master's degree in religion. And once that was over, I was like, oh my gosh, I have been doing academic reading for the last decade. I'm done. And so I really dove into fiction and I usually read like 50 to 65 books, novels a year, which is why this is a hard question. I will say that I just recently went to an author signing by Sarah Adams, who just writes like chick lit type books, a little romance, which is really fun. But I don't know if I have a favorite book. I really like Jodi Picoult. I really like, there's a book called The Frozen River that my local book club just read this last year that I really like. But I just like a good escape novel, whether it's historical fiction or chick lit type stuff or thrillers are always really fun. Yeah, there's too many. There's too many to name.
That's perfect. That's great. So, are you an introvert or an extrovert?
I am an introvert, and I don't think people believe me sometimes when I say that. I just by the nature of my job, and I can be outgoing, but it drains the life out of me, which tells me that I'm an introvert. If there's an opportunity to stay home rather than go out, I will 100% always choose staying at home. There's like a joke about, the joy of missing out instead of the fear of missing out. The joy of missing out is absolutely me.
No, I resonate with that actually. I'm learning that about myself as I get older. And there's nothing wrong with knowing where your energy sources come from. And if that means retreating and filling your cup in that way, great. More power to you, right? So,
Yeah.
tell us your favorite artist.
Ooh, like painting, oh, I
You
don't know.
choose.
Okay, so I really like Georgia O'Keeffe. She's like the Western, yeah, lots of flowers, lots of feminine imagery. I think I got to go with her.
I love her as well. She's great. So tell us your celebrity crush.
Ooh, these are good. So I am a 36-year-old that probably acts more like a 66-year-old. So I don't even know like who is cool these days. Like literally don't know who is cool. But
That is awesome.
I have had a lifelong crush on Gregory Peck, which again shows my like boomer side of my personality, but he is good looking. I mean, back in the day, like, yeah, Gregory Peck.
That's awesome. I love it. So are you a night owl or morning lark?
Morning. Yeah, I like mornings. My kids have finally started to sleep in, and so especially on the weekends, I can get like a solid 2 hours or more that I'm just kind of by myself, which is exciting.
Which goes back to that introverted piece, probably. That's great.
Yeah.
Do you do still carbonated water? Are you a diet soda fan? Some other fun beverage? What's your preference?
So I really like coffee. Having an expanded version or vision in the word of wisdom was very exciting for me. So yeah, I love a good coffee. I'm also a tea drinker, and then just regular water. I don't love carbonation, so that might be the one thing that makes me not really Utah. But yeah,
Yeah.
I'm a coffee gal.
Okay. And then finally, the furthest place that you have traveled.
Ooh, I'm not well traveled. That is one thing about getting married super young and being super poor and, like in college when you start having babies right away. I'm trying to think. I have been to Mexico and then I've been to like New York City from Utah. So that's not very far, but that's Florida. I've also been to Florida, the East Coast.
I think all kind of travel is valid and fun and great. It's all mind expanding and
Yeah.
exposes you to new and different ways of living, being, new ideas, all of it. Thank you so much, Brittany. If folks wanted to connect with you or reach out to ask questions or whatever it may be, what would be the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so I am on Facebook and Instagram and Threads, just as Brittany Mangelson. And then I also, you can find me at brittanymangelson@gmail.com. I monitor the Salt Lake Community of Christ Instagram and Facebook page as well. So if you DM someone there, you're DMing me. There's that
Oh,
too.
that's good to know. That's perfect. I'll leave all of that in the show notes. And again, thank you so very much. So grateful for your perspective and your insight that you have shared and left with us today about your journey. And I know it will touch others in their own along their path. So appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Writer, teacher, author, Mormon scholar, and founder of Dialogue Journal, Eugene England said, "My faith encourages my curiosity and awe. It thrusts me out into relationship with all creation and encourages me to enter into dialogue." As a proud member of the Dialogue Podcast Network, my hope is that Living Beyond the Shadow of Doubt podcast is an extension of that vision. Visit meganskidmorecoaching.com to find this podcast and additional free resources, including the link for a complimentary coaching session. Follow me on Facebook or Instagram for more or to send me a DM. Help the podcast grow. Please follow, review, and share with a friend.